So the New York Times has just published its list of must-see places for 2019, and nestled quietly in the top 25 destinations is none other than the Falkland Islands. But we're not talking about a tropical paradise here, we're talking about a remote archipelago in the South Atlantic, more than 700 islands exposed to the harsh elements with a tiny population of just 3,000 people. It's a territory as empty as it is inhospitable. Nevertheless, this wind-blown backwater was the cause of intense political tension in the second half of the 20th century, culminating in a war between the United Kingdom and Argentina.
One thing the islanders have made it perfectly clear. These islands are British. They are the Queen's loyal subjects. They wish it to stay that way.
It's important to understand here that for Argentinians, the Falkland Islands is a national issue. Argentinian children learn very, very early that the Falklands are a part of Argentina. For them, the British occupation of the islands was nothing more than imperial plunder.
En la paz con hidalguía y en la paz con honor, pero también dispuesto a escarmentar a quien se atreva a tocar 1 metro cuadrado del territorio argentino.
So given its controversial history, the New York Times list sparked a few questions. Do the Falkland Islands belong to Argentina, and why are they so important to mainland residents? After all, Argentina is a huge country, in fact the 8th largest country in the world, so why all the fuss about this remote, inhospitable, and largely uninhabited archipelago? Well, this video aims to answer these questions. But first things first, let's find out how it all began.
The origin of an endless dispute.
The beginning of the 19th century. The Spanish colonies in America begin to protest against Spanish rule. The recent United States Declaration of Independence and the French Revolution have ignited a desire for autonomy and freedom that cannot be suppressed. In 1808, the Napoleonic invasion of Spain led to the dismantling of Madrid's power, and that kicked off a race towards independence that more or less resulted in Latin America as we know it today. So it was that on May 25, 1810, just 2 years after the French occupation of Spain, the Municipal Council of the city of Buenos Aires decided to replace the Viceroy of Rio de la Plata with the first government junta. Argentinians today think of this as their first patriotic government. Argentina was on its own road to revolution, but it wouldn't be free of Spain until 6 years later. On July 9, 1816, came the proclamation of independence of the United Provinces of the Rio de la Plata. And this is where the first confusion arises. You see, many people think that the viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata, created in 1776 by King Carlos III of Spain, was synonymous with what we know of as Argentina today, but this wasn't the case. Let me explain. While it is true that the viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata included modern-day Argentina, it also included Uruguay, Bolivia, and Paraguay. Alright, so some of you might now be thinking, well, hang on, Simon, where do the Falklands fit into all of this? Well, the fact is that Uruguay, Paraguay, and Bolivia, along with the Falkland Islands, were all part of the viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata. And the thing is, I don't think you'll find many Argentinians claiming sovereignty over Paraguay, Bolivia, or Uruguay these days. And of course, if they did, everyone would think they were crazy. So, well, why the Falklands? The fact that the Falklands were part of this mammoth viceroyalty which belonged to the Spanish crown is not really surprising. What is surprising is Argentina's claim on the Falklands, especially given that until this territory was consolidated as a British sovereignty, it was passed back and forth between European powers numerous times.
From hand to hand, from play to play.
The history of the Falkland Islands is actually much simpler and shorter than many people think. You see, until the mid-1700s, the Falkland Islands weren't even inhabited on a permanent basis. Indeed, the first people to live there permanently were not the British or the Spanish, but the French. Yep, you heard that right, it was the French who first permanently inhabited the Falkland Islands. But that is only the start. Between 1764 and 1833, the islands passed from one nation to another. First from France to Spain, then to England, then back to Spain, and finally, since 1833, the Falklands have been under British sovereignty. So let's do some quick addition. Since they began to be permanently occupied, the Falklands have been under Spanish sovereignty for just over 40 years and under British sovereignty for more than 180. So why does Argentina stake its claim quite so vigorously? Well, it all goes back to the time between the May Revolution and the subsequent declaration of independence of the United Provinces of the Rio de la Plata. At that time, the local authorities began sending expeditions to the Falkland Islands, which they considered their own. And this is precisely where the controversy arose. Because while the Argentinian version insists that the English snatched part of their territory in 1833, the truth is that at the time Argentina was still a work in progress and its borders were far from defined. And if you're not convinced, well, check this out. Just 5 years before the British returned to the Falklands in 1833, Argentina lost Uruguay. What's more, it took until 1862, that's almost 3 decades later, for Argentina to have a national president. In other words, in 1833, when the English regained control over the Falklands, Argentina's borders were yet to be decided, there was no Argentinian national government, and so, of course, they had nothing like a national army. In fact, it may seem hard to believe, but between the years 1852 and 1860, the state of Buenos Aires wasn't even part of the Argentine Confederation. But in the grand scheme of things, this isn't so extraordinary. Stories rely on the continuous changes in rules of the game. Viewed through a historical prism, sovereignties come and they go all the time. Now, it's clear that history can be framed and interpreted in many different ways. And that may explain why many Argentinians insist that when the English reasserted control over the Falklands in 1833, the islands were already a part of Argentina as we know it today, and therefore are a part of the Argentinian homeland. But let's see, because 190 years later, can you guess how many people of Argentinian origin live on the Falkland Islands today? That would be 18. In fact, there are almost 10 times as many inhabitants from Chile as there are from Argentina. Nevertheless, not so long ago, the contested sovereignty was grounds for war.
An unexpected war.
Ever since the British regained control of the Falkland Islands, Argentina has wanted them back. It's been like a national obsession through the generations. In 1888, they began publishing maps that included these previously disregarded islands within Argentina's borders. Now, let's just be clear that apart from the map redesign, there were no great claims on the Falklands from either side until the Second World War. Up until then, Argentina and England were two friendly allies. In fact, the Latin American country that received the most direct and indirect investments from England was Argentina. But after the Second World War, everything changed. For one thing, commercial relations between the countries were no longer as significant. Secondly, the election of General Perón as Argentina's president gave weight to his nationalist and anti-imperialist discourse. And thirdly, the newly created United Nations was focused on the process of decolonization. In fact, UN Resolution 2065 invited Argentina and the UK to clear up the matter of the Falklands sovereignty in 1965. But within 2 years of this resolution, the situation had taken a 180-degree turn. In 1967, London told the Argentinian government that it was willing to cede sovereignty over the Falklands, but on one condition. They had to respect the wishes of the Kelpers, or the Falkland Island inhabitants. The only problem was that the Kelpers opposed any sovereignty transfer point blank. In fact, they actively mobilized against the possibility by creating what became known as the Falklands Lobby. And it seems that at the time the British government was willing to deliver, or at least share, sovereignty over the Falklands in exchange for commercial agreements. So let me stress here that it was the island's inhabitants themselves who prevented this.
In the mid-1960s, pragmatism would have probably led the British government to transfer the sovereignty of the Falklands had not the Falklands lobby arisen to counter the pressure of Argentine demands. Clive Ellerby, an English researcher, author of the work Role of the Falklands Lobby.
And that is how things stood on April 2nd, 1982.
Que sepa el mundo, América, que un pueblo con voluntad, pueblo argentino, si quieren venir, que vengan, les presentaremos batalla.
On that day, a grim military government led by General Leopoldo Galtieri held power in Argentina. It was a discredited and repressive regime without the people's support and responsible for one of the darkest periods in Argentina's modern history. Many citizens were branded political prisoners and thousands more simply disappeared, and a huge economic crisis it was crippling the economy. On that day, Galtieri's government made a fateful decision. Gain the people's support by feeding their patriotic fervor. And with that, the Argentinian government decided to invade and occupy the Falkland Islands. The Argentinian authorities expected this move to spur a diplomatic agreement with the UK. However, they underestimated this woman's determination. Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, was willing to fight a war thousands of kilometers away. The outcome? Well, it was disastrous.
The people of the Falkland Islands, like the people of the United Kingdom, are an island race. Their way of life is British, their allegiance is to the Crown. They are few in number, but they have the right to live in peace, to choose their own way of life, and to determine their own allegiance.
The British Army's technological and military superiority, coupled with the Argentinian government's lack of planning, they carried out the invasion with many young, poorly equipped and poorly trained soldiers, allowed the United Kingdom to recover the islands in a little over 2 months. So once again, a tyrannical government's political decision ended with a war as unnecessary as it was useless, costing the lives of hundreds of people. And look, we know how sensitive these types of border issues can be, and with this video we want to put some facts on the table and maybe give you a new perspective. Because throughout history, territories have passed from one power to another. For more than 300 years, what is now Argentina was under Spanish rule. For more than 180 years, the Falklands have been British. But what does it matter who was and wasn't right 200 years ago? Isn't it more important to think about where we are today and try and build a more harmonious future? Just a little reflection from us at VisualPolitik. Now here are some more questions. Why is there so much interest in the Falklands? What's special about these islands? These are topics we're going to address in an upcoming video here on VisualPolitik, but before we go, we'd really like to hear your thoughts. What do you think should happen to the Falklands? The comment section should be fun. I really hope you enjoyed that video. Please do hit that like button if you did, and don't forget to subscribe for brand new videos. Also, don't forget to check out our friends at the Reconsider Media podcast. They provided the vocals in this episode that were not mine. Also, this channel is possible because of Patreon and our patrons on that platform. Please consider joining them and supporting our mission of providing independent political coverage. And as always, I'll see you in the next video.
Si quieren venir, que vengan, les presentaremos batalla.